there's one voice that we want to seize on for this part of the story, because this is a big part of the story. You heard Congressman Jake Auchincloss earlier use the phrase blood for oil when we spoke with him, the Democrat from Massachusetts, a critic of this operation. But even the president of the United States has said that we are there to get our oil back. Bob McNally has had his eyes on this from his perch as the founder CEO of Rapidan Energy. Not only an oil market analyst, but we talked to Bob a lot because of his sensitivity to politics, having spent years as a White House energy advisor to President George W. Bush. He is also author of the book Crude Volatility, The History and the Future of Boom-Bust Oil Prices. Bob, it's great to have you back. I'll ask you about motivations in a moment, if you'll indulge us. I just wonder your thoughts on the immediate impact on the oil market and whether we see a softening in prices. What's about to happen?
Happy New Year, Joe and Christina.
You too.
You know, I think we're going to see what happens over the weekend, but assuming no unrest that leads to disruption of energy production and flows, I think it'll be pretty modest. We were looking at about 300,000 barrels a day of lost production due to the blockade on sanctioned tankers. Now, unless we have a really friendly regime on tomorrow night, I think we're still going to see that blockade. Venezuela's running out of places to store its crude. Ships are afraid to go in. So I still think we're looking at that relatively modest loss of supply. But I don't think the market's going to be too worried about it. You know, Joe, we've talked about this for years. Since 2019, the market's been in yawn mode when it comes to geopolitical disruption risks. And that includes Russia and Iran, let alone Venezuela, which is pretty small. So all else equal, I would expect the market to be pretty soft. Here's the one different thing, though. The president has been very vocal about Iran and met recently with the Israeli prime minister, clearly stated he's opposed to Iran trying to reconstitute its missile programs, nuclear programs, and threatened to intervene to save protesters if they are shot. So I think one thing that's going to happen, and we're surprised this hasn't happened already, is markets are going to take President Trump a little more seriously when it comes to threats involving energy, when energy is at stake.
That's really interesting. And I'm wondering how you see other major petrostates. I'm thinking Saudi, Russia. How do you see them responding to this U.S. action? And how are they going to feel about the U.S. wading into some pretty interesting geopolitics here that could impact a lot of financial markets around the world?
Well, I think the major oil producers, Saudi Arabia, UAE, others in OPEC Plus, are mainly considered worried about stability of prices in the near and the long term. Near term, Venezuela doesn't really threaten much. If anything, we're going into oversupply. Wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if we lost a few barrels from places like Venezuela or Russia. But it's really long term where OPEC Plus will be focused. Venezuela is a founding member of OPEC. It was the first. And I think there's some discussion in Washington, there's some buzz, will President Trump pressure a friendly post-Maduro regime to leave OPEC? I think no, he will not. But that'll be a concern, I think, that you'll see a little bit. But that's longer term, depending on what kind of regime follows Maduro.
We should note that the FAA is now notifying commercial airlines to avoid Caribbean airspace. This is a headline that just crossed the terminal from Agence France Presse, citing a potentially hazardous situation amid military operations to capture Maduro. Of course, this is apparently said and done. The president telling Fox News a short time ago that Maduro and his wife are on the USS Iwo Jima right now on their way to New York, where they will face charges. The reaction from China has been pronounced. Bob McNally saying that it is deeply shocked by the strikes on Venezuela and its capture of Maduro, strongly condemning what it calls the U.S.'s blatant use of force against a sovereign state and action against its president. As Venezuela's biggest oil customer, what does this mean for Beijing?
I think it's a lot of bark and not much bite from Beijing. Venezuela is about 4% of their imports. Now, look, they're getting those barrels for a steal. Chinese teapots love to slurp that heavy, sour crude oil at bargain basement. Who wouldn't enjoy doing that? But there's other oil available, Russia, even Iraq, Canada, other countries make it. It's not fatal for Chinese imports. It's not as if we're cutting off Russian or or Iranian supplies. That would be much more material for China's energy picture. So, and I think China respects spheres of influence. I think the real question, Joe, folks are asking is, well, does this mean that President Trump will give China a free hand in Taiwan, or President Putin a free hand in Ukraine? If we can do Venezuela, can these other? I think not. I think that's overplayed. But that, I think, is the question, is what will Beijing conclude about its ability to act in its own backyard?
And what is the horizon for U.S. oil development in Venezuela? If all were to go according to the administration's plan, somehow the American oil companies, more than what's there now, got in and were able to start taking over. What are we looking at? How long would that take, and what kind of impact would that be? We've talked about its heavy oil sands crude. A lot of it is refined already in Louisiana. It's not easy to use. What kind of impact would that have on the oil market overall?
Well, it's a long and winding road, to invoke the song, really. There are claims still outstanding, or payments still outstanding, from the nationalization of U.S. projects 20 years ago when I was in the White House and we got kicked out. There's all kinds of questions about the status of the infrastructure, maintenance, and so forth. So I think companies will be excited, but cautious and deliberate, and there's all kinds of legal and political questions. So, I see some estimates out there that Venezuela could be up by 2 or more million barrels a day in 5 years or so. I think we're a little more cautious. It is a potential huge increase if you can get those heavy oils projects restarted again and upgraded and so forth. Huge potential increase, but I don't think it's around. I think we're talking about many years, Christina, many years, lots of uncertainty, long and winding road.
Really interesting. We have the indictment, Bob and Christina. It is 25 pages long, and I'm looking at the PDF as we speak. I just did a quick search while you were talking, Bob. The word oil is only used once. There are repeated references to drug trafficking and some of the other charges that he's facing. Was this about oil or not?
Partly it was about oil, Joe. No question. The president has made that very clear in his public remarks. I'm very sure, even going back to the first term, Venezuela was in the sights of the Trump administration, partly, not entirely, but partly due to oil. The president feels U.S. companies were unjustly kicked out. Our adversaries were invited in, not just in oil, but in narco trafficking and other things. And sort of, Venezuela is just the poster child, if you will, from what your earlier colleague was talking about, which is the first manifestation of the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Oil was a part of it, not the only thing, but certainly a part of it.
All right, Bob McNally, thank you so much for making us slightly smarter on that issue. Joe's already smart. I'm catching up a little bit here, but we really appreciate it. Founder and president of Rapidan Energy Group. We appreciate you joining us.